Yeah, I think it is. I think a lot like most of these kind of cult classics, there will always be kind of a niche that will find its way. It's a lot like I look at Kids or Train Spotting, and those films will always have a lot of fans. They may never be super mainstream, but I think it will always be relevant. And I think, I'll touch on this in the next question, but there's a lot of overtones of drug addiction in the movie, and I think that that's pretty important to talk about in today's society. So,
I think it is, if for simply the enjoyment of the film and being a Tarantino film. I know a lot of people enjoy those these days because he kind of gives a modern take to the 60s, 70s kind of campy action movies, and they are very fun, and he does edit them interestingly. Pulp Fiction, much like Kill Bill Volume 1 and Volume 2, has chapters to it, and they're out of order. So it kind of leaves the viewer to put them together in their mind and this as the story unfolds, which is kind of interesting. And some of the characters overlap, and that's kind of a staple of his. The characters overlap and overlay. Kind of like in Love Actually, where everyone seems to know each other as friends of friends of friends of friends. So,
Pulp Fiction is still relevant today because it touches on subjects such as violence and drug abuse, and I think it's relevant today because those things are kind of always an issue. I mean, the movie is 20-something years old, and those are problems, that were dealt with back then or being dealt with today. So I think the movie is still relevant today.
So because who doesn't love a good story about all that stuff anyway?
The film is still relevant today based on the drugs and the violence in the movie. It is still prevalent in today's society. With technology the way it is, we get to see more what's going on in the world, and so I think that this would resonate a lot with people and in seeing what is really going on in the world. So them seeing it in a film many years ago would really stand out today and let them know that this is really going on in the world with drugs and violence.
I'd say that it offers a look into a life that a lot of us don't especially live. There's a lot of violence and drugs and kind of things that your everyday person doesn't really experience. I think one of the most iconic scenes in Pulp Fiction is the scene where Uma Thurman's character overdoses and has to have the epinephrine stuck into her heart, and for a lot of people that offers kind of a glimpse into like the terror and seriousness of what drugs can do, and not in a non-judgmental way, which I think is important, and it's not one of those movies that especially glorifies it, but it's also not one of those kind of like Just Say No movies.
I suppose it kind of reflects on the times a little bit, being not quite a period piece, but also kind of a period piece. It's shows a great view of the human condition and different lifestyles. Absolutely.
I guess to go along with that, from the timeline being that things don't seem to change, that there's always going to be those problems, so it kind of gives the modern audience the chance to look back in time and to observe history with a different perspective.
It shows kind of insight of how movies were back in the 90s, and I feel like, they were a lot more, open about stuff, sort of. And it just kind of shows how like gangsters and drug dealers and stuff were back then in the 90s as well.
Not an audience, I believe, will see what the true scope of drugs and violence is in the world, and seeing it with modern technology now would resonate a lot with them, but seeing it how it was back when the movie was made would offer a lot of insight into maybe how to correct those problems that we have now in the world.
There are definitely some boundaries that got pushed. Obviously you have Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta playing two lead roles together, which a lot of times doesn't happen. A black and a white man playing lead roles together, as well as having Uma Thurman play a pretty like independent, free-thinking woman, which I think, especially when the film was made in the '90s, was just kind of starting to become relevant and become used. As far as politics, I don't really know. I mean, it's about like gang violence and murder and gangsters and drugs. So I don't know what it says about politics, but I definitely say that some boundaries got smashed as far as gender and race and where those can fit into the movie industry. But I think it's just one of those movies that people will always look back at and will always kind of be regarded as a cult classic, which I think is great. So
did about as equally as anyone else, which was good because Jules would have shot you if you hadn't, and as partially was his right. It's gender. There wasn't really any like misogyny or anything in it, so as far as being anything that we've gone over in class, I don't really see how it's really has any feminist movement in it. It's not that they're against feminists, it just is not a main focus of the film. Uma Thurman's character was confident in her own way. So
Not really quite sure what it says about politics. I don't remember anything very political about the movie, but I guess it's just another one of those things to kind of takes a look back in history about how people dealt with racism and genderism back in the 90s.
All of that stuff was kind of out in the open on the table because they like to have deep discussions about, anything and everything. So I feel like no matter what it was, they kind of touched on the topic about all of them. And racism was still then. Politics were really big back then in the 90s as well. So
Politics, that's a tough one, but the politics involved in the movie, not so much, but people have brought politics into it because of race and drugs and other issues. But as far as in the movie, there was no politics involved in it. Gender and race, well, what does the film say about that? It says it can happen to anyone.